We will be building this interactive price component with vanilla CSS and JavaScript. Everything you see is styled by just normal vanilla CSS. And by using its vanilla JavaScript, we can interact with this component and we can output certain data that will basically be updated as we change the page views. In this case, as we go up in page views, let's say we go up to 1 million, we have changed our price to $36 a month. And if we select annual or yearly billing, then we also update this billing frequency from month to year, as you can see. And everything else is achieved with CSS and HTML.
The first thing I usually do is I start playing around in Figma and I just start doing some measurements and just trying to analyze the design. Do whatever you need to do during this stage, but all I'm really doing is just trying to think how to structure my stuff in HTML and just looking at things like, different gaps between certain elements, etc.
To get started, I'm just going to show you what I've done. I've copied the README and I've actually updated it with my own stuff. I have an index HTML where I've connected my styling of Reset CSS and my main CSS that I'm actually going to be using and writing. And of course, I'm using my script .js, so we can write some JavaScript later on. I'm adding the fur to it just so I make sure that the script runs after we load our HTML within our body. And here, just to show you the folder structure, I've got some design photos that I'm just going to be using for personal reasons, later for my README, images that we will be using in the design, script, styling, and of course our index. It's time to start writing some HTML. First, we're going to have a body initially, but then usually I would say it's better to contain something in a container. In this case, we're just going to have a container for this entire section, and we're just going to use a main with a class of card wrapper. The next thing to focus on is the fact that we don't really have a proper heading for this. Like, there is no heading that tells us exactly what this component is. And to us, visually, it might make sense, but let's say someone using a screen reader may not really know or understand that this is just a component page. So we can actually create one with a h1. We're going to have a class of SR, or screen reader only, and I'm just going to have interactive pricing component. We're not actually going to show this heading on the website, but it will be readable by a screen reader. And then we can focus on the fact that we've got this kind of like a header for our main. So let's try adding a header with a class of pricing card header. And then we have a h2, simple traffic, blah, 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 and of course the same for the paragraph. Now this spacing doesn't actually mean anything. I just added it for myself just to remind me that I'm going to need a separate line or just enough space so this text is actually split by 2 lines. Okay, now we can start focusing on this entire card. And because this entire card, it seems to have a few inputs, right? The first input is a range input. Then we have this custom toggle, and finally we've got this button that I suppose starts your trial or submits the data. So to me, this is a form. And it makes perfect sense, especially since we have an input, right? This is a form. So the first thing we'll build is the form in its entirety. Okay. Then we've got this little thing. Now this could be a label for this input effectively. Now I'm not going to use a label. I didn't really see a point, but you can absolutely use a label. And if you think I'm making a mistake by using a span, that's all right, And this, of course, will be an input with a type of range. And yeah, so let's just code this for now, and let's see how it looks like. So first we have a form with a class of pricing card. Then we have an empty action, because we're not really going to do anything with this data. We're just trying to build the UI here. The next part, like I said, will be a span, pricing card views with the text of 100K page views. Then we have an input of pricing card views range. The input will have a type of range, a name of range, ID of range. Again, feel free to do anything as you wish. So if you have a label, be more specific if you want. I just did this stuff just because it's a single component. Minimum of 1, maximum of 5, and a value of 3. and of course step by one. So what all these things mean is that you can only pick the data between values 1 and 5. Each time you move a step, you move by 1. And the current value, so when the user actually goes on a website, it will be free. So it's right here in the center. And the reason why I'm using 1 and 5 will become clear when we move on to the JavaScript section. And I'm going to explain everything then. The next thing we can build is this price container. The first thing here is basically the price. And then here we have the billing frequency. So if we start by doing that, first we have a div just to contain the two things. We're going to give it a class of pricing card price container. Then we have a span, again, because it's not really a paragraph, it's not really a heading. It's a span pricing card price, and we're just going to write it in normally for now. And a span that's basically billing frequency with the billing frequency, that's the default. Then we can focus on creating the HTML for this custom toggle. Now the custom toggle, I'm not going to tell you it's massively complicated, but it is slightly more complicated to explain, so I'll spend a bit more time on it. The first thing we can start with is a label, of course. Why a label? Well, because we can actually contain everything you see here can be within the label. So if I click on the text monthly billing or yearly billing, it will actually activate the label. As opposed to me just clicking on the label here. Now you might think that's not preferable behavior, and you can absolutely write this in a different way. I just prefer to work this way. So the label will have a class of pricing card, billing frequency, toggle. Okay. And it's going to be for billing frequency. And you'll see what that does in a moment. Then we have a span of pricing card frequency option, because monthly billing is a frequency. Then we're gonna do the same thing, just add dash monthly. Dash monthly because it's gonna have something more specific later on, and you'll see. And then I'm just gonna input the text monthly billing. Then we have an input that will be a checkbox and has the name and ID of billing frequency, which matches our label. And in HTML, what labels allow you to do, if you click on the label, it allows you to actually basically click on the input. And as long as you have the for billing frequency and the ID of billing frequency, this label, whenever it's clicked on, and whenever anything inside, including the span, for example, is clicked on, it will activate that checkbox. Then we have another div, well, not another div, now we have a div, with a class of toggle. So finally we're getting to the toggle itself. And this will be the kind of like the background to toggle effectively. And then we have a span and a toggle circle. And that's, of course, going to act as this little circle within the toggle. Then we have another span, frequency option, but this time it's an annual frequency option instead of the monthly one. And of course, yearly billing. And for this minus 25%, and of course for the desktop, the minus 25% discount, I'm thinking we're going to use a pseudo element. So let's just do that a bit later on. And finally, we can focus on this bottom section over here. Now, when I noticed this, this border over here, this line basically, when I noticed that, I was thinking like, I could use a, like a span just to thingy or something. But then I just decided that this entire thing can just basically be contained within a div. And this can be a border top with two things, like a container for these features and a container, or not even a container, just a button in itself. So just to start us off, let's create a div, and we're just going to call it price card bottom for this entire container. And we're going to have a div pricing card features, which will, of course, house free features. Now, each feature will basically have each feature will be a span of pricing card feature. It will have an image with this icon check. I'm going to put this alts later and stuff. And a span of unlimited websites for the first one. And we're just going to have two more with data ownership and the email reports. And then we can just finish off with the button, which will be type of submit, just because this is a form. So when you click on a form button, it's a submission of said form. It's going to have a class, pricing card submit button, and of course, just the text in itself. And this concludes our HTML. We don't actually need anything else, I think, except just maybe adding these spans, maybe like tick icon or something like that, or mark complete, whatever you prefer, whatever you think is correct. That's all good. Yeah, we can now move on to writing some CSS. I mentioned before that I use a reset.css file. All I do is I basically copy and paste some code from the web with a few small changes. The first change is that I'm setting the box sizing to the root as well as to any element to border box. And I'm setting the root to font size 62.5%. Now what this means is that 1 rem will actually equal to 10 pixels now instead of the usual 16 pixels. This makes it much easier to work with rem, as now you can imagine 1.5 rem is 15 pixels and so on. We don't need to do any calculations. And the final addition that's custom by me, I believe, either both of these or just the button one. If we quickly Google CSS Reset, I'm going to show you exactly where I get it from, mayerweb.com. Just go to here, copy this code, and make the small changes that I made if you want to. The first thing I like to do when I'm starting my CSS is I start with just importing the font, and if it's a single font for the whole project, which is ideal sometimes, just set it as the font family for your entire HTML document. And you might remember that I mentioned the screen reader only class for this heading earlier on. I copied this code, but all this code means basically is that it's going to be there. It's going to be parsable by a screen reader, but we're not going to be able to see it as the user. That's all this code means. Cool. Now we've got some basics down. Let's start by styling our body. So the first thing is obviously select a body. And I like setting up some min heights. Min height is a good thing to do in every project, because let's say your component is too small. You at least want the background to go all the way down to the end of the page. I would assume so. So this is what you can do, just to avoid any like weird gaps in your pages if they're too short. Then I always set up some padding. I do this usually by calculating stuff in Figma. So as you can see, this is 89 pixels here. So I'm using 8.9 rem. And then we have 24 pixels and 86. I'm going to refer to these as rems in going forwards, but you can really easily convert this stuff just by moving the decimal point to one step to the right, and then you get your pixels. Cool. I've got my display grid, place item start center, and let's see how this looks like. All right. So the start is actually align items, I believe. The first value is the align items property. Cool. The align items in this case is how do you want to position your content within your grid vertically. And the second one is justify items, which is horizontal. Then we have a background. That's a mistake, I believe, that I'm going to delete in a moment. But then finally we have a URL. So we've got this background image that's going to pop up, as well as an actual background color that's actually going to go behind the image. And if I show you how that looks like, so that's the background color here. And this is actually the image, this very soft curve, if you can see it. If you can't see it because your screen lacks some color, I'm basically going to draw it how it looks like. That's the curve over there. And I just want to background size out to 50%, and that's going to be applied to the first image because I'm not putting a comma for the second one, which is the color. Whoops. And that does it for the background for mobile for now. I don't think we have to put too much more effort into this. Now, I'm doing mobile first, so you might be thinking like he might do some media queries here or something afterwards. I'm gonna actually leave that to the end. After I finish the initial mobile first version of this component. Okay, so the next thing we want to style is a main, basically the wrapper that we have. So the wrapper basically will wrap around this content over here. And it's basically our main or class card wrapper. So let's start by doing that. Card wrapper display flex, and we want it to be a flex column. The next thing will be aligning items to the center. And if we look at it just moves stuff slightly to the center over there. There's a gap of 6.4 rem that I easily got by clicking on this, holding on my keyboard Option, or I believe Alt on a Windows keyboard, and you can see the 64 popping up in the red. That's 6.4 rem for me. And width of 100%. This is just a safety feature for later on. Okay, so the next thing to style was this container for me. But this container, of course, has this background image that's a different size from it. And I kind of was struggling initially before I realized that I can use the height of this element and just use a pseudo class to contain this image. I'll show you how I did that exactly. And you'll have to wait until the end of styling the text as well to see the full effect of this image actually being showing up properly. So if we start with pricing card header, which is right here in our DOM for this header, display of flex, it's also a column like the previous element. We're also going to be aligning stuff to the center, and there's a small little gap with position relative. Then we absolutely want to position our pseudo element of before. Position absolute, content will be empty just so this shows up, because without it, our pseudo elements do not actually show anything. We have a background that has no repeat and center and a width of 100%. So for now, you shouldn't see anything. Now, as soon as I set a height, you'll see it, but it seems like there's a small bug in the design, right? Because it's not showing the whole thing. And that's okay. You'll see that changing when I update that text. We can translate it. In this case, this is translate Y over here. And we're just moving it upwards by 1/3 of itself, or 1/3, right? And you see it is basically positioned in the center. It's just not showing the whole thing. And let's continue by styling this, basically the first real visible heading. For us, it's H2. With just some basic stuff, font weight, size, line heights, and so on. Text, align center. We don't even need text align center, I think, but that's fine. And we're setting the color as per the design over here. And then you can set the paragraph, same things basically, and check this out. So because we have updated our line heights and font sizes, it updated the height of our header, which in turn finally managed to match the height needed for this background image to be properly shown. And that's kind of how I did that. You know, like it might not be the nicest solution. You might have thought that maybe we should just have this height of this container to be bigger. I don't really work like that, but feel free to, alternate into your own direction. I did forget something. I forgot that this paragraph has to be split onto 2 lines, as right now you see it's just 1 line, and if the display is really small, it's going to actually shrink. That's not what we want. Right now, as we are right now, we actually want it to shrink, just like that. And later on, in the breakpoints I picked, which is 620 pixels, just based on the design and what made sense to me at the time, we're just going to unset it later on. So yeah, I just thought I should mention that, yeah. All right. So the next section to style for us is basically the card itself over here. And we know it's a form, so we can actually start by selecting a form and the class of pricing card as we have it over here. I'm going to start with just adding the background just so we can actually see it a bit more clearly in our browser. Width as 100%, so you see that's not exactly what we want, but we do want it to grow. So we're just going to set a max width of 540 rem. Now initially, of course, this would be a smaller design that we're actually working with. 370, sure, 376. Display of grid. Display grid for now won't really do much for us, but it's okay because we're actually going to use grid for when we style the desktop. Because as you can see, this, for example, moved from here to here, and I don't exactly want to mess too much with my HTML, but CSS grid is perfect for this kind of thing, because you can place things however you want, really, without too much hassle. We're going to have some box shadow over there, some border radius and paddings, of course, and we're going to have a gap. Okay. Justify items to the center. So as we discussed before, this is the horizontal justification. Cool. Nice. Now we can move on to pricing card views. So that's this element over here. And that's just going to be some very basic font styling for the most part, as you can see. Nothing really drastic. Whoops. It's time for us to start styling this custom range input field. So let's see how we can start by, right? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select it, and if I just show you that in my HTML quickly, let's go to this input, pricing card views range. So I've selected it now, cool. We don't actually need that for a while. And margin and max width. Okay, so I've just changed some very small styling. Now, I found this on CSS Tricks. I'm going to leave the link down below as to the complete guide to resetting your range input, just in case if you're interested. I've copied the link here just so I don't forget to mention that. And okay, so we're going to select an input with a type of range. And for now, we're going to have WebKit appearance of none. So let's see what that does. Okay, so we've basically made the line disappear, the bar. Width 100%, background transparent, otherwise it remains white in Chrome. And this width is specific to Firefox. Oh yes, it'd be worth mentioning that I made sure that this works in Safari, Chrome, and Firefox. I ignored things like Edge and Internet Explorer. I'm pretty sure Edge will work though, but Internet Explorer will not. The full guide, however, does include how to make it work in Internet Explorer. So there's that. Now we're going to select WebKit, and WebKit, I believe, is initially it was made for Chrome, WebKit. And slider thumb. So we want to make this slider thumb disappear. And if I just save that now, it's gone. And same for Mozilla. I want to have outline none, border none. Cool, save that. And finally, when it's focused, we want to have outline none. What that does is it removes the border in all browsers, I believe. And you can just, you know, when you select something and there's an outline around it, yeah, like a button or something, you can, that's where you add this. I decided to outline none just for now, just to keep stuff simple though. And just to kind of ease us in as to how it's going to look like when we're styling the, you know, Chrome stuff versus the Mozilla stuff. I tried using like a comma, you know, for shared code. I'm not sure why it wasn't working. Maybe I just made a mistake or something. That's okay. If you figure it out, then you can just do it correctly or for a shortcut. But basically, because I'm going to have a lot of repetition, I also ended up creating a bunch of variables initially, and I'm going to come back to them if they're important to come back to. But for the most part, you can see that, you know, I've got some thumb dimensions, which is this circle over here. Border radius, of course. I've got thumb background, hover background, active background, and the box shadow, I believe, for the thumb. That's over here, right there below the actual thumb. And I'm going to be adding code that looks more or less identical. So I just don't want you to get confused. Yeah, it's going to be the same code using these variables effectively. Okay, so let's start by styling the thumb. The first thing I want to do is select the WebKit slider thumb. And in Chrome, this is actually required in Chrome as it's mentioned in the guide that I will link in the description. And, you know, we're going to set a height and width with our dimensions. We're going to set a border radius, cursor pointer, of course. The background will be the image on the top, and then otherwise it's going to be background. Let's see how this looks like. So now you can actually see the thumb is here. So we've got this image with these two arrows, and otherwise the background is going behind it nicely. Yeah, that's over here. And then we go on some box shadow, nice. And we want to transition the background. Really, we're going to transition the background color, but that's fine. So because background is a shortcut, remember, and if it has a background color, it's actually going to write it as background color within the browser. So when we hover over it, we want it to change. Nice. And same thing here. And the only difference for Firefox will be that we don't have the margin top. Everything else is the same. So that's why I told you this will be mostly repetition of code. Everything is just the same. But now a thumb is effectively complete. So thankfully, nothing too complex. Maybe it may look slightly complicated initially because, of these selectors. But all in all, you'll probably agree with me that these are very basic CSS properties that we can use to style this. We can start styling the track now. The track is the bar or the line, whatever you want to call it, really. And now let's just set up some more variables for ourselves since we're going to have more repetition of code. We're going to have a track height, background, and border radius. And I made a mistake earlier on. I should have actually grabbed this left, as it's going to be important in the track, not the thumb. So let me just delete that. Okay, so left will actually be important, and just keep in mind that the value of it is 50. Okay. And if we start styling the actual track, for now let's focus on the WebKit one. We're going to have set a width, a height, a cursor pointer, and a background. And right now, you'll actually see that we do have a working track. Border radius, of course, just so we get those slightly rounded edges there. And a background image. And now you might be thinking, a background image? We don't have an image for this, right? But if you pay attention, like we do have this colored, basically a rectangle, right? A colored line. And like, how can we achieve this? So when we drag this across, that the line will also be updated somehow. Well, whilst part of this will be explained through JavaScript later on, for now, just assume that this value, this variable of left, will be changing as we move this, the thumb. So let me show you how that might look like. We're going to set up a linear gradient, and we're going to set it to right, so it's going from left to right. We're going to give it a color. Let's see how this looks like for now. Nothing, perfect. Then we're going to set a calculation of variable left. So right now it's value 50 times 1. And what this transforms into is 50%. And the next bit will be transparent, so there's nothing going to be on the right, and it's going to be just 0%. So 50% will be this color, and there will be no color on the right. It will be transparent. So let's see how this looks like. Look at that. And basically the idea is that later on, when we drag the dial to the one step to the right over here, it's going to be 75, or it's going to be 100, or it's going to be 0, right? Like that, or 25, or back to 50, which is our starting point. And again, don't worry too much about understanding how. I'm going to show you exactly how later on. And of course, to style the Firefox bit, we can just pretty much paste the same code. This is identical. The only difference is here. But if I highlight all this code, just comparing to the above, you'll see it's identical. Now with the reg input out of the way, we can focus on this element over here. So let's get it started. We don't have to spend too much on this code. It's just going to be a normal flex row, justify content to the center. There's going to be a little gap between the two. And of course, aligning items to the center. Cool. Nothing too major. Then we just have very basic styling for the text of the price, just so I can show you. Literally, it's just text, font weight, size, height, letter spacing. I'm not going to waste your time discussing that. And finally, we have the billing frequency, just some nice styling over here. Okay, now it's time for the slightly fun part, which is the custom toggle. I remember when I was making my first toggle, it didn't come out too well. So it was 9 months ago, I think. So it was quite fun coming back to it. And let's just do a refresher. We've got a label, and then we have the span with some text. So the text, as you can imagine, is not massively important to us. What we're really mostly focused on is the fact that we're working with a checkbox, and we have this custom toggle, and then finally the toggle circle that's inside of it. Okay, I'm gonna close that, as hopefully I'll explain everything I'm doing as I go along. So the first thing we want to do, custom toggle, billing frequency, which is actually a checkbox, this, we want to display none. Because the checkbox is still there, it's still working for us, it's still being checked, right? but we don't want it to be showing because we're building a custom toggle with using checkbox logic. And the first thing we want to do is pricing card, billing frequency, toggle. So this is actually the label, right? We have a display of flex, line item center, justify center, everything's just there. We're going to have a little gap there. Cursor will be pointer, of course. So when we click on stuff, it's going to be showing a cursor pointer. Transform translate. We want to move it slightly to the left because this is actually not centered perfectly. So if I group these items, you can kind of see it's, okay, in this case, yeah, so it's slightly more to the left, as you can see. Literally a few pixels, in this case, 6 pixels, yeah? Margin bottom, and I'm clicking save every time I do something, just so you can potentially view the change on the right, yeah? And here I wanted to note that the width in design for the toggle itself, this gray box here, is 43 pixels, but I used 44. Yeah, so me. Height, border radius, and in a moment you'll see, cool. Now we've got this basic shape with very few lines of code. Transition, we don't want a background to transition. Okay, and now we can style the circle. Cool. Display block as well. Nice. Height, width, yep. Background, okay. It's in the right position thanks to our padding, I believe, which is just 4 pixels all around. And border radius. Cool. So now we actually have well, it looks correct, right? Now all we have to do is when we click anywhere here within a label, we want this to move, you know, so we want some colors to be transitioned just to symbolize that the toggle has moved, or to us developers that the checkbox has been checked. Transform translate. For now, I'm just telling myself that I'm going to translate something just as a reminder. And okay, when a checkbox is checked, so that's how you write that. And when a checkbox is checked, we're going to select a sibling element, yeah, and we're going to select the toggle, .toggle, and find the toggle circle within the toggle, the direct child. I'm going to translate it by 2.2 rem. Let's see what happens. Look at that. Very nice. So yes, I did the calculations. I don't know, this might be like a percentage thing. I could have done something with variables to calculate stuff, but I didn't. So I'm just going to work with this. Cool. And then again, when we hover over our label, in this case, so this is for label, and we want to select the toggle, as well as when our checkbox is checked, we want to select the toggle, we're going to change the background. But let's see. Look at that. So the background is changed. Yeah, we've toggled it. Cool. So now we have got this nicer visualization of what's happening, I think. And finally, I didn't spend too much time explaining this. This is just basic font styling again, just to style the fonts on left and right. The only special mention I will give is the fact that I'm adding a media query for this 25%. Because Frontend Mentor gives us 375 pixel design, but sometimes, you know, you can have a phone that's like 320 pixels in width. So our design would make no sense in that case. So what I prefer to do, instead of changing the design, I just added a rule that before this, we're not going to actually show it. And of course, it's a pseudo element because we've got position relative, content minus 25% initially, position absolute, width will only be max content, left, top, transform. Let's see how we go. Cool, padding. Okay, we finally got some background. And I have to zoom out. Oops, not here. Click into here. Okay, now we can see it. It's okay, you can actually start seeing that it's pretty much there. And then if we make this slightly smaller, it should disappear. You can see that it would just break the design if we just kept it in with position absolute. So I just added this safety feature, so to speak. Let me think. The next thing that we can focus on in that case is pretty much the last bit, which is this container over here. So to start us off with this features container, let's add a width of 100%, because as we know, we have this line that's going to be spanning 100%, so we just want that. Display will be a flex, it's going to be a column, and aligning items to the center. There's going to be a little gap between the features and the button. And of course, there's a padding of 2.4 rem for the horizontal, sorry, for right now, for the vertical, or y-axis. And we've got a border top. So now it's kind of looking much closer now. And for the features, we're probably going to have a column aligning items to the center with a small gap in between them. Nice. Okay, it's already looking really close. And then each feature inside features and will be a flex as well, gap 1.6 rem. And a flex, I use flex, by the way, because I like using gap, right? Display flex, straight away, what it does is it gives you a flex row. It's no wrap, so it's not going to wrap. And all you have to do then is just gap, align items, and it's just really easy to control the content inside. I've seen some developers, they don't use flexbox and they position stuff with a bit of transform translate inside for like these tiny things or positions absolutes. I don't do that if I don't have to, because I find this approach to be the easiest. And just some basic font styling then, just so we actually match our design. And finally, we can style a button. Our button will be a width of max content. We'll have some padding, border radius, and a background so we can see it. Cursor pointer, some basic font styling, and finally the color. And what we want is when we transition the button, we want the color to change on hover to white. Okay, let's see. Cool, so everything seems to be working fine. And the last thing we have to do in our CSS is make this work for, tablet and eventually desktop. Before I carry on, I thought I could explain a few things a bit better, or at least take just a tiny bit more time on them. You can skip this if you're familiar with these particular selectors, so just skip to the next section. But like for example, if we just focus on line 258, yeah? So we first selected our checkbox. Whoops, sorry. We first selected our checkbox. We're checking if it's checked. So whenever we click on a label, we're checking a checkbox. Then I said initially that we select the sibling. This isn't actually like a sibling selector. The more accurate thing, let's say this is a paragraph, good, and unordered list. Selects every unordered list element that is preceded by a paragraph element. So yes, it's a sibling relationship. What it's saying is that this .toggle has to be preceded by this billing frequency that's checked, because it's a checkbox input of checkbox, right? And then we're selecting a direct child of toggle circle. This is specificity I didn't actually need to add, but I just added it for, well, don't know, just wrote it this way. But yeah, you don't actually need it. And what this is select all paragraph elements where the parent is a div element. Okay, that's all really it's saying, like, yeah. And the next one that I kind of felt I skipped over is whenever we're hovering over our label, so in this case, just like that, over anything that's a part of a label, yeah, we are selecting the toggle. We're selecting the toggle, and then we're just changing its background. And same, whenever our checkbox is checked, then we're selecting the toggle inside, just like above. This kind of like more like a sibling relationship, and we're also changing the background. That's all. So yeah, maybe that's useful for someone. Okay, now it's time to start adding some media queries. So the first one we have to tackle is, as you can see, our background is basically cutting off because it's reached the end of its natural width based on this 400 pixel height. So all I'm going to do is a somewhat lazy solution is first I have to update the padding top for the body, But the main thing is background size. I'm changing from auto and 400 pixels to contain. If I save that, you can see it's just going to remain responsive now. And I can go on and on. It's going to look ridiculous, but most of the time people look at around this width. And the one we're designing for, I could add some maximum, by the way, but you know, I just, it's not important enough. I mean, it's just a background image. My focus is on here. The next thing will be for card wrapper, just a change in gap. Show you, that's all. Then price header, again, just a tiny gap increase over here inside this header. And of course, we gonna change the heading too. All we're really changing here is just the size of the text, just the same with paragraph. And the next thing we can focus on will be the pricing card. The pricing card. So starting with the pricing card, let's spend a bit of time on this one. So I just chucked in all the code and you can see a bunch of stuff broke, and that's okay. That only broke because I've now changed it to a 2-column layout instead of just declaring grid, right? Grid auto rows, max content. Technically, I could have just left on auto, or I could have not even used it, but I don't know, I declared it just for my own sanity, perhaps. Padding, so I did update the padding from 3.4 to 4. RAM, align items center, which before I didn't need, but now I do. And of course, the gap is slightly increased from 3.4. The next thing will be the views. So the views, honestly, just some slight styling changes. Just okay. The next one was pricing card views range, and pricing card views range kind of fixed a lot of stuff for us, because all of a sudden I could add the specific row where it's supposed to be, right? And the grid column, so it's supposed to be between 1, 2, and 3, so between the 3 lines. And of course, max width has to be adjusted just because of this width that it naturally has. But yeah, overall, that's still working fine. I don't think there were any changes in the input. The next ones were somewhere over here. So pricing card price container justifies itself to start. Yeah, so if you spotted that before that, the text is kind of dragging outside. And if I inspect this really quickly, what we want is the form grid. You can see it's not a lot of space, and it kind of perfectly matched the extra space that was needed, you know? So in this case, I just moved it to the left and everything just matched quite well with the design. Then the next one was here, pricing billing frequency. So let me just save that. And again, just some basic font styling changes. Frequency toggle. Okay, so toggle obviously has to be centered. So if we center it now, perfect. And the only thing we really needed there is grid column 1 to 3. The translate X, I removed it, as I believe it was also removed in the thing. Yeah, I believe it was also removed in the thing, in the design. And of course, for the discount, it's minus 25% discount in desktop. So we're just going to add that there. Nice. Price card bottom. So we're really reaching the end now. It's just going to be some basic stuff like, you know, grid column, just so we have that full percentage. Now we're changing it from a flex column to a row, just so these two items are side by side instead of on top and bottom of each other. Padding and justify. And the remaining bits will just be, you know, moving this text. Sorry, I should have shown you that. Bad of me. Yeah, so, you know, obviously initially this was centered text, and now we want it to be just moved to the left or flex start in this case. And the last thing I believe was just a submit button. I don't even need that, to be honest. I can delete them. Steady. Cool. Yeah, that's it. And this is basically the CSS and HTML of the card complete. I could improve tiny tweaks here and there. It's pretty damn close to the design though. If we looked at it, see if we can sort of position it. Different way. Okay, that's it. It's not in. Okay, I don't know how to get the exact zoom, but you can see it's pretty similar now. Yeah, not exact, but pretty similar. So the next bits that we're going to focus on are the JavaScript. We now have a fully styled component, but it has zero interactivity. We can move this range about, we can toggle the toggle, but it doesn't change the information presented. So the first step would be to, of course, add some JavaScript. And within JavaScript, the first thing we want to do is to grab whatever components we might need to grab data from or we want to manipulate. So initially, when we're grabbing a DOM element, let's grab a views container. I'm calling it container because it's going to contain some text. So I just didn't want to just call it views. I have my range input, which is over here. My cost container, which is over here. My price frequency container over here. Frequency toggle, which is of course a toggle. And finally the form in itself, which is the entire card, or the entire form component really. And the first thing to do, of course, is always to just console log stuff, just to see that you have actually grabbed everything correctly. As you can see, we seem to have everything. The next step would be to create some data, because instead of working just inputting data from the abyss, we can actually just create a data constant, or just a constant variable. The reason why this is in all capitals and it's spaced by this underscore is because I'm following a convention in programming. I'm not sure what language it's from. I believe it's C#, but it could be something else, but it's also considered good practice in JavaScript. You write the name of a variable this way if it's a true constant. It's something that will never change. And I believe it's something that will also be globally accessible. And right now, a constant is an empty array. So a way to think about arrays, it's a list of things. And it's an indexed list of things, rather, which is going to be important later on. Then we create an object as the first item in this array. And we're going to pass in this property and this value. So page views and 10K. Monthly cost, 8. And left percentage, 0. So the way we're going to use this is quite simple, and I'm going to focus on a middle example. So this is all my data, 10K, 50K, 100K. So these are the page views, which is over here. The 16, as you can see right now, is 16 over there. And left percentage currently is 50. And you might remember that I have this left 50 variable, yes, in my CSS. And we're going to use this variable to actually change the position or the width of our background image, which is actually a linear gradient, just to represent us moving through this range. And that's going to be important later on. I'm going to explain how it works and all that stuff. The monthly cost, of course, is going to be later parsed as string, just so it has these, the decimal and the 2 decimal points places. And 100K is just a string that we're going to update into here, along with this page views word. And the first thing we want to do is to stop the default behavior of the form, because currently if I click this button, it refreshes the page. That's not currently the behavior we want, so we can actually easily add form, add event listener, submit. So when the form is submitted, we're going to pass in this event object. And event object actually has an inbuilt function for us, which is prevent default. And prevent default literally prevents the default behavior of the form. So now I'm clicking on it, but nothing is happening, which is the desired behavior. The next step is to add an actual event listener to our range input and to give it some functionality. So let's start by doing that. We're going to select our range input and add the event listener. In this case, every event listener can actually just be, every input rather, can have an event listener of input. So whenever it changes, it's going to activate something. In this case, we want to pass through a function called updateForm on range input. Okay. And let's create this function. This is an arrow function syntax. UpdateForm on range input. And the first thing we want to do is update our page views. Then we want to update our cost. And then we want to update that left variable. So let's do these step by step, just broken down nicely. UpdatePageViews will be a function of its own. So let's create that. And then what we want to do is we want to grab the page views from a function called getData. And you might be wondering like, okay, page views, getData. So what you can imagine is that because we're updating page views, we somehow want to grab page views, the correct one. And the way we're going to do that is by creating a function that gets it for us. So let's create this getData function. And this getData function, you can assume it's going to return an object. So if you're not familiar with the syntax, this is called object destructuring. And what it allows you to do is to grab a specific property, just like page views, for example, from an object. And you can just grab this instead of grabbing, like, you go into views data, put an index there, and then dot page views. You can just use this syntax. And I'm going to show you a bit of that throughout this example. So let's create the current value, which is range input dot value. So what that's going to do, every time we're moving this now, we're actually grabbing the value, and that's okay. We don't worry about this yet. That's actually grabbing the value of the range input. And if you remember, it starts with 1, goes to 2, 3, 4, and 5. And because we have an index of data, but the index starts with 0, we would like to create an index value now. So let's create the index variable, current value, which is whatever we have, take away 1. So now we're going to go between 0 and 4, which is what we want. Then we want to return an object. And what we want to return within this object is actually the page views, the monthly cost, and the left percentage from views data, and whatever index we're looking at. So we're effectively returning this, all these properties just quite separately. Now, we don't necessarily have to do this. We could just do views, return views data index, but I decided to be a bit more obvious in what I'm actually returning. So when I'm reading this function, I don't have to scroll up to my views data. I can just read exactly what I'm returning within here. So sometimes the code will be longer, but for me, at least, it's going to be more readable, which is preferable. Anyway, so now we should have our page views returned to us. And let's see if it's going to work. So views container, when I grab this views container over there, text content, so we just want to update the text content of this, backticks, and because I'm using backticks, I can use this syntax to provide my page views, as well as just add to the string page views. Let me just save this and let's see what happens. And look at that, it's updating correctly. Now you might be slightly confused as to why certain things are happening, so I'm going to try going through them. Let's copy this and let's instead write a const, yeah? And let's instead do this, and we're gonna have that, and we're just gonna say we wanna basically, whoops. Oh, what I wanna do is copy that above. Let's say we just wanna run this function, getData, when we're updating our page views, just so I can show you. So const data equals views data index, and let's see what it returns us, right? Console.log data. Save that. I'm gonna drag this across. And you can see we went next to the next step. Page views 500K, monthly cost 24, left percentage 75. Maybe I'll zoom in a bit for that. And that's all well and good. This is effectively our data. And like I said, we could just return that. Or we could do is page views, for example, and then we could do .page views. And you'll agree that this would be very long and very tedious. And what we can do instead is const page views, which actually grabs page views from views data index. Yes, whatever index we are, let's say we are index 2, so the third item. It's going to grab us this object, but because we have this object destructuring in place, we're only going to grab the page views. And to avoid this entire thing looking like a mess, that's the reason why I wrote it this way. And you can see I wrote it just like I would have written it as a variable. But this is just a nice way that you can just return this stuff, because really there will be no benefit of writing this as a variable and then returning an object that would basically say the same things. And then let's just delete this and uncomment everything. Okay, so the next thing we can focus on is creating this updateCost function.
And to start writing the updateCost function, let's actually create a function here called updateCost. So we're going to call it, and then we're going to actually create it. And then, because we already have this getData function, and we just want to grab the monthly cost, we can just call the same function to get our data. We're just grabbing a monthly cost from it. And then we want to check something, because let's say this. Let's say if our cost is annual, we want to be dragging this stuff across, right? And every time we want to be checking, is it annual or not? Because if it's annual, this has to go for some calculations, right? Because we only have monthly costs, not annual costs. And what we want to make sure is that we output the correct cost. So first for that, let's just create this check. Is it annual? And we're just going to create isAnnualFrequency as a function. Let's create that function. Const isAnnualFrequency, it's an arrow function. We're going to return frequency toggle, right? So literally we're just checking if this toggle is checked. That is all you need to do. And what this will return us is true or false. If it's true, then yes, we have annual billing because it's checked. If it's not checked, then this will return false. So isAnnual is false, therefore it's monthly. That's actually the nice thing about using Boolean values, trues and falses, that kind of stuff. So is it annual? It sounds like this variable can only be true or false, right? Is annual, yes or no? So that's just a nice clean way of writing something like that, I think. And then let's create a price, because like I said, we want to be checking if it's annual, and then we want to output the correct price, the correct value, right? So if it's annual, and this is a template literal. This is a very nice syntax that basically works if and else. So if it's annual, and this is the first if it's annual, we want to check monthly cost times 12 times 0.75, because remember there's a 25% discount. So we're going to times it by 0.75, and this will actually return us the correct value. Otherwise, we want to just return monthly cost. Okay. And this will return us a very clean number, just doing the monthly cost calculations, right? So it's either going to do this calculation, or it's going to return us monthly cost. And then we want to output that to the cost container, which is here. So cost container.text content is template. So this is backticks, $sign, just as a normal $sign. And then I'm putting a $sign just to give our variable of price. And this would work so far. I believe this will work. So now if I just do that, you can see it's correctly updating. But you can see that the 2 dots disappeared. We don't have a decimal place, so we can really easily fix that with using toFixed 2. It's gonna output this as a string now. It wouldn't output it as a number with toFixed. And it's gonna go to 2 decimal places. Let me just save that, and voila. But if annual is ticked, let's see, look at that. So everything's working nicely, right? And I think there was one more check. So if it's annual, we want to also update our price frequency container, which currently says month, which is incorrect. So price frequency container text content is this dash and year, okay? Otherwise, price frequency container text content is month, just like we have it now. So let's see what happens. I'm going to click yearly billing, and I'm going to go here. Okay. So everything's working nicely. It says per year, per month. Okay, so this actually is, our cost is now correctly updated. The only thing we could add now is, I suppose, a listener to update the cost whenever we toggle this as well. And to update this toggle behavior, this is very simple. We're going to grab a toggle. We're going to add an event listener to it. We're going to check if something is input. Again, this is just whether we're checking it or unchecking it. Now we're going to simply run the function of updateCost for us. So if I just click this, it goes through this function, it checks if it's annual, it updates the price to annual, or just selects the monthly cost, and then outputs it correctly along with updating the price frequency container. And as a last step, we have to update our left variable. Let's start by doing that. So first, we're just going to create this function now, updateLeftPercentage. Okay, we're going to grab the left percentage from our getData, because again, as before, we've already taken care of that with this getData thing. And you can see that I did go through some thinking before I wrote this
this particular data. But I just wanted to show you this nice and efficiently within the video. And then we have form.style, set property. And set property literally is like, if you want to go in CSS, we're setting a property and then we're separating it by comma. So you'll see that we're getting the property of --left. We're going to update it left percentage. And just to be clear, notice that I'm selecting my form. And because I'm storing these variables within my form, right? So that's why I'm selecting a form. I'm actually storing my variables in form. It's not stored in the HTML like, let's say, well, like you would usually store variables. It's not really set there. And that's kind of it. And then remember that we have the logic running that will convert our left percentages to, let me just check, linear. It's going to convert them to percentage because we have this times 1%. Let me just save everything and let's see what happens now. And look at that. It's updating our variable. And if I go to elements, you can see this left there, and it's actually updating right over here, which is literally our desired behavior. So that's very nice. And this kind of concludes the JavaScript aspect of this as well. Everything is being updated now. Our component is fully interactive and it's fully styled. Before I finish, I thought I would add one last step, because actually this function is called updateCost, and it does two things. It does update our cost, which is correct, but it also updates our price frequency container, which, whilst it's directly related to this updateCost, I was thinking we could separate that in its own function called updateCost. Let's just do that quickly. Cost const updatePriceFrequency. It's going to be an arrow function that takes in the isAnnual variable and or argument, because it's a function. And we're just literally going to grab this the code from below and just call the function with isAnnual. And this will still work. Everything is still functioning, but it's kind of broken down as well. So when we're updating our cost, we also want to update the price frequency. And we're also going to be checking if it's annual within it. And I think that concludes everything. Here we are.